Today we are here to talk about the decontamination of flexible endoscopes, and in this particular series we are focusing purely on the cleaning of flexible scopes. Before we actually start getting into how to clean a scope, it's very important that we remind ourselves about flexible scopes themselves and the actual term of endoscopy. And remember, endoscopy simply means to look inside the body. Of course, we can look inside the body with a rigid scope, we can look inside the body with a flexible scope, and we can look inside the body in multiple areas. We can look into the abdominal cavity, into the bladder, into a joint, into a knee, into a hip, into a wrist even. Today, though, we are focusing on flexible endoscopes, and when we use flexible endoscopes, we generally enter the body through a natural orifice, for example, the mouth or the anus. There are a number of flexible endoscope procedures that can be performed, and we will use different types of endoscopes, obviously depending on what area of the body that we're going into. The most common procedures will include a bronchoscope when we look into the lungs, a gastroscope, which is a forward viewing scope that we can look into the esophagus, the stomach, or the duodenum. A colonoscope is used for viewing the colon. And a duodenoscope is a very special scope. It's a side viewing scope, and it's designed for ERCPs, endoscopic retrograde cholangiopancreatography. With this type of scope, we are going to view or possibly do some form of procedures into the bile duct or the pancreatic duct. Additional scopes would include something like a choledocoscope. There we are looking into the biliary tract and the gallbladder intraoperatively. A cystoscope, where we look into the urethra and the bladder. A ureteroscope, which is used for viewing the ureters. And then, of course, we get ultrasound endoscopy type scopes, an EUS and an EVIS, used for GI endoscopy. When we're cleaning flexible endoscopes, it's really important that we use the right type of brush and the brush that's got the right diameter. If you have a look at the images on the screen, firstly, the image on the right over there, you can see a little bristle, and that's a piece of brush that's been left in a channel. That piece of brush can end up inside a patient. If we're using the wrong size diameter, a piece of bristle can break off. Or in fact, if we're using a brush that's gone through a lot of wear and tear. We know that theoretically we are meant to use a new single-use brush each time that we clean a scope. It's very important to bear that in mind, because if you try use a single-use brush multiple times, the chances of a bristle breaking off are quite good. And that can be of great risk, and you'll end up leaving a foreign body inside your patient. Looking at our images on the screen, if you've got a brush that's too big, it's going to potentially get stuck or also not clean properly. If you've got a brush with bristles that are too small, you're not going to actually touch the side walls and you won't really clean properly. So here we can see what the ideal size of a brush looks like, that the brush has good contact with the side walls and gets good friction. How do you know what size brush to use? Well, you're going to learn that from the endoscope manufacturer. Sometimes it's written on the side of the scope, but ultimately you need to make sure that you've got the right brush with the right diameter for the make and model of scope that you're about to clean. Also important to be familiar with the anatomy of your flexible endoscope. Important to know the parts so you know what it is you need to inspect and what you need to clean. We like to divide the scope into three main parts. The universal cord, which is the big clunky section that goes into the camera stack. The insertion tube, which is the part that goes into the patient, either into the mouth or the anus. And the control body. The control body is where all the knobs are, where we will actually control the bending section of the scope. A very important part to also remember is on the camera stack itself is the bottle. That's the bottle for water for irrigation. Some units may have fancy irrigation systems. Others may just make use of that bottle. Now, that bottle is another potential source of infection. It's not something we're covering today, but a very important part that you must also bear in mind. If we were to open the sheath of the scope, of the insertion tube part of the scope, this is what it looks like. It's incredibly delicate. There are a number of parts and pieces that end up inside of this section. It's got the outer tubing. We take away the outer tubing. These are all of the bits and pieces. In here, you can see the biopsy channel, which we also refer to sometimes as the instrument channel or the working channel. Now, that very first part of the biopsy channel from the distal tip is reinforced. You can see that there's a nice metal section to it, but past that, it is not reinforced, and it's merely a piece of plastic tubing. Now, sometimes our patients bite down on this section and can cause great damage quite quickly and readily to that section of the scope. We also are going to be putting down biopsy forceps down that channel. Remember, if you feel any resistance when you're putting down a brush or a biopsy forceps, please be very cautious because you can perforate that particular simple tubing. If you do that, we will end up with ingress of microorganisms into the scope. Let's have a look at some of those images. To prevent damage to the scope, an important thing that we need to do is to do a leak test. With the leak test, we're pressurizing the scope to see that that biopsy channel is intact. If there's a hole in that, once we submerge the scope into some form of liquid, there is a good chance that that liquid itself, whether it's detergent, whether it's patient contamination, whether it's feces, whether it's gastric solutions, can all end up inside of our scope. Looking at this image over here, this is some form of contaminant that's ended up inside a scope. And you would not know that because you would not be able to see it. Imagine somebody doing a scope on you with this contaminant inside the scope. Is that corrosion? Is that feces? Who knows? In research conducted in the South African setting in 2015, which was a while ago, but I bet that it's probably relevant still today, in 80% of all of the cases where G-scope was cleaned manually, a leak test was never performed. I wonder what those results are in your hospital. Now, those inner channels that we need to clean. They're complex, but very important. Starting with the blue line, that's the water channel. The doctor depresses the valve for the water. The water will come in through this part, through the universal cord, all the way through the tip of the scope and out the front. Looking at our next line, if you have a look at the red line, that is the suction biopsy line. And it's very important that we brush the insertion part of the red line as well as from the control body down to the tip of the scope. Both sections must be brushed. Take another look at these bits of the scope. The image on the left are all of the components that make up a scope. It's really a complex device. Look at the image on the right, you'll see all of the parts that are actually encased in that outer tubing. You'll see over there that we've got the channels that we've already spoken about, but including there are the angulation wires for bending the scope, the signal wires for the camera image, and the fiber optic light guide cable. All of that crammed in this outer casing, all of which we need to make sure we clean properly and we manage and maintain. Another very complex scope is that of a duodenoscope. And we're having a look now at an image, the distal tip of a duodenoscope. And remember I said it's a side viewing scope. Looking at the arrow, you can see where the lens is, where the light is, where the elevator wire is, where the air water nozzle is. Now that elevator is very, very important. We need to be able to insert items into the biliary tree. And to do that, we need to get round a corner. And to get round the corner, we need the elevator to pop up. Whilst doing some routine audits in a department, a standalone GI unit, I went in to try and test the scope for residual protein. When I asked the unit to please lift the elevator in the scope, nobody knew which button to press. And sadly, when we eventually all worked out how to lift that elevator, this is the amount of tissue that we found buried underneath that elevator. And there had been incidents of patients that had died in that unit after ERCPs. Now, there are numerous published papers linking flexible endoscopes to outbreaks of infections, and I could spend hours talking about this, but I won't. But we will highlight a few of the published papers that we have seen. And the very first one that caught my eye was back in 2013 by Ofsted and Al. And Ofsted made a very important statement, I believe to be 100% correct to this day. Contaminated endoscopes have been linked to more healthcare-associated infections than any other medical device. Here are a few more published papers, and here these papers talk about transmissions of infections and outbreaks relating to all sorts of pathogenic microorganisms, including, let's see, carbapenem-resistant Enterobacteriaceae, Klebsiella pneumonia, varicella zoster. How awful is that? This is a published paper looking at 8 years of duodenoscope contamination. In this particular time frame, there you can see often up to 94% of scopes were contaminated. The biopsy and suction channels were the most frequently contaminated channels, and duodenoscope contamination really remains a problem to this day. Here's some more examples. In this table over here, you can see scopes and patients. Look at the number infected. Those are the number of patients that were infected from contaminated scopes. Patients got pneumonia, patients ended up with lung tuberculosis. All of this from a contaminated scope we didn't clean properly. G-scopes have also been implicated in outbreaks of Salmonella and H. pylori, Pseudomonas as well. Here's some on ERCP scopes, 25 patients with sepsis because of contaminated endoscope washer disinfectors, inadequate disinfection, inadequate cleaning, patient with a liver abscess. So how do we actually reprocess our scope? Of course, cleaning is a multitude of steps, and the entire reprocessing is a number of different steps. So the World Health Organization lists them in the following setting. Begin with a bedside or a pre-clean, move on to the leak test, followed by manual cleaning, rinsing, drying, rinsing, and drying again. The process flow may vary from departments to departments, but in essence, these are the steps we need to be following. At the end of the scope, do a bedside pre-clean. Move the scope to a safe area, perform a leak test. After a leak test, we do the manual cleaning. In some instances, the scope may go for manual high-level disinfection, or in fact, the scope may end up having low-temperature sterilization, or the scope may be going into an endoscope washer disinfector. That will depend on your circumstances and your department. The South African standard SANS 373, which every department who performs scopes should have a copy of, defines scope cleaning into the following steps: bedside cleaning, safe transport, leak testing, cleaning, inspection, disinfection or sterilization, and storage. For today, we only focused on cleaning. Also would be very important that you clean all of the accessories correctly, like the valves, and very important that we verify that our scopes are indeed clean. Netcare currently makes use of residual protein testing to ensure scopes are properly clean. Don't forget to don your PPE. Now, research found that routine reprocessing generated substantial splashing, specifically when reprocessing scopes, and visible droplets were generated quite far distances, just under a meter, just by simply filling the sink when you're washing the scope. Please be very cautious and make sure you're wearing PPE. Now remember, before reprocessing any scope, it is absolutely critical, repeat that, absolutely critical, that you consult the manufacturer's instructions for use for your particular make and model of scope that you are going to clean. So now that we've reviewed all the published papers on the outbreaks of infections associated with these endoscopes, let's start looking at how to do this practically. We've looked at the steps as guided by the World Health Organization. We've looked at the steps as guided by the South African national standards. And here we're going to begin with the importance of the bedside cleaning. Here our scope technician is blowing through air as well as suctioning through detergent water solution. Once we have finished sucking through solution and we've blown through air, the next important step is to clean the outside of the actual scope. He's now cleaning the insertion part of the scope, and he will then be cleaning the control knob as well. As we saw on the slides earlier, the design of the scope is so complex and it is absolutely critical, and I repeat that, critical, to do the leak test. If we don't leak test, we will find that our scope can be really contaminated. Once we know that the scope is safe and has passed the leak test, we can safely now submerge it fully in water. As you can see, our technician has fully submerged the scope and has begun the process of cleaning the outer surface of the scope. Don't forget, you'll need to clean the control body, the insertion tube, and the universal cord. You would, of course, have prepared your water detergent solution, a fresh solution for each scope, according to the manufacturer's instructions for use. Remember to have all of your cleaning accessories and attachments on hand. Make sure you have the right size diameter of brush. And here you can see we are beginning to insert the brush to clean the ports and the channels. Our technician inserts the brush and is cleaning with a back and forth motion. A back and forth motion has been shown to be very effective, as well as a spinning motion. Importantly, the technician looks at the tip of the scope, at the tip of the brush, as it comes through the scope to make sure that it is clean. He rinses that tip and cleans whilst removing that brush again. Remember that the suction tube and the biopsy tube, they are both the same channel at the end of the day, and we need to make sure that we clean each of them from each angle. We're brushing from the suction cylinder to the distal end of the endoscope. Remember to keep control of your brush. Make sure you're wearing the correct PPE, including eye protection, as there is a good chance of splashing at this point. Ideally, this cleaning should not be being performed next to the patient's bedside. We should be taking our scope off to one side where we are cleaning it. Important to clean the biopsy port itself. We need to remove the cap and clean the cap. At this point, our technician is going through the biopsy port cap and brushing down the biopsy channel. The brush comes out the tip, he's examining the tip, rinsing it off, and cleaning as he pulls out the brush again. Now our technician is focusing on the valves, using the correct size brush and cleaning the valves themselves. The next step in the process is to flush our channels. In this case, of course, we are flushing with the water detergent solution. Begin by applying the adapter seals. The reason for this adapter is that we want to allow for unidirectional flow of the solution. Make sure you have all the correct attachments based on the particular make and model of scope that you have. Apply the connections as directed by the manufacturer, as you have been trained. And ensure that you flush through the right volume of water detergent solution, again as directed in the manufacturer's instructions for use. Once the scope has been thoroughly cleaned, we need to move the scope to the rinse water. Always prepare a fresh batch of clean potable water. Submerge the entire scope in the fresh water. And rinse all the channels as per the manufacturer's instructions for use. Depending on the manufacturer, you may need to irrigate 2 or 3 times, perhaps with 20 mils, 40 mils, 60 mils, depending on those instructions. Clean potable water each time. The clean water helps to rinse out detergent residuals as well as potential contaminants. Remember, detergent residuals themselves can be problematic. They can cause infections in the patient. Thoroughly rinse each channel as directed by the manufacturer.